Let's talk about designing the outer-facing contract. It consists of three big concepts a consumer of an API uses to interact with that API. First, the resource identifiers. In other words, the URIs where the resources can be found. That is combined with HTTP methods like GET to get resources, POST to create them, and other ones we'll look into. These methods are part of the HTTP standard, which you can find via the link on screen. Third is the optional payload. For example, when creating a resource, the HTTP request will have to contain a representation of the resource you want to create. When getting a resource, the HTTP response will contain a resource representation in its response body. The format of those representations is what media types are used for, like application JSON. We'll dive a bit deeper into that subject once we're covering content negotiation later on in this module. We'll start with the first part of the contract, the resource identifier. We looked into the uniform interface constraint in the previous module. It covers the fact that resources are identified by URIs. But as far as naming of resources or URI design guidelines is concerned, there is no standard that describes that. There are, however, best practices for this. A resource name in a URI should always be a noun. In other words, a URI should refer to a resource that is a thing instead of referring to an action. The action, that's the HTTP method. So we should not create a getAuthors resource. That's an action. We should create an authors resource. That is a thing, conveyed by a noun, and use the HTTP get method to get it. To get one specific author, then we append it with a / and the author ID. Using these nouns conveys meaning. It describes the resource. So we shouldn't call a resource orders when it is in fact about authors. This principle should be followed throughout the API for predictability. It helps a consumer understand the API structure. If we have another non-hierarchical resource, say employees, we shouldn't name it API something else employees. We should name it API / employees. A single employee shouldn't then be named API / ID / employees. It should be named API / employees / the employee ID. This helps keep the API contract predictable and consistent. There's quite a bit of debate going on whether or not we should pluralize these nouns. I prefer to do so, as in my head that means it helps convey meaning again. When I see an authors resource, in plural, that tells us it's a collection of authors and not just one author. But good APIs that don't pluralize nouns exist as well. If you prefer that, feel free. Just make sure you stay consistent. Either all resources should be pluralized nouns or all should be singular nouns, but don't mix and match. Another important thing you want to represent in an API contract is the hierarchy. Our data, or models, have structure. For example, an author has courses. That should be represented in the API contract. So, if we want to define an author's courses, where the courses in the model hierarchy are children of one author, we should represent them as you see on screen. A single course by an author should then be defined as the URI for all the author's courses followed by the course ID. Note that this does not mean that you cannot expose the same data via different URIs. For example, you could expose all courses via API / courses and then expose the author's courses via the URI you see on screen here. That is perfectly allowed. There is a clear separation between how you expose your resources and how they are stored in the data store. APIs often expose additional capabilities, like allowing filtering the resources or ordering them. Those parameters should be passed through via the query string. So you shouldn't write something like what you see on screen here if you want to order the authors by name. There's a few contract smells in that URI. A plural noun, for example, should always be followed by an ID and not by another word. Order by is not a noun. And a URI like this would mean that we potentially defined three different resources: author/order by and authors/order by/name. That is not what we wanted to do. We didn't want to define new resources, we want to order our already existing authors resource. So API (order by equals name) is the way to go. And with that, we've already covered a lot. But there's an exception. There always has to be an exception. Life would be too easy without them. Sometimes there's these remote procedure style like calls, like calculate total. That doesn't easily map to a resource, right? Most RPC style calls do map to resources, as we've just proven. We don't have a get authors by name procedure. We have get API /authors (order by equals name). But what if we need to calculate the total amount of pages an author wrote? And let's assume for the sake of the example that it's a very productive author. Calculating this would take quite a bit of time, and we don't want to send it over together with every author by default. It's not that easy to create a resource from that using pluralized nouns. You could end up with something like you see on screen now. And then what? We'd expect this, seeing it's a pluralized noun, to return a collection and not a number. API /author page totals / an ID, where the backend would then have to map that ID to an author ID, or it can even be the same ID. This would work, and it does follow our guidelines. But at the same time, this is one of those exceptional cases where I would suggest to take a bit of a pragmatic approach, if you want. Something along the lines of what you see on screen now is not according to these best practices. But as long as it's an exceptional case, it does not mean that you've suddenly got a bad API. Remember, there is no standard for this. These are just guidelines. There are other approaches possible as well. For example, implementing a system where you can choose which author fields are returned in a resource. That's named data shaping, and it's covered later on. Anyway, by following these simple rules, we will end up with a good resource URI design. Do remember though, these URI guidelines don't make your API more or less RESTful. They make the API more predictable and easier to consume when writing code against it. Now, when we talk about URIs, we're also talking about routing. Let's have a look.